terms of video game history in North America, some epic console wars have occurred. Atari vs Mattel and Coleco, Nintendo vs Sega, PlayStation vs Xbox and more, with many battles for market supremacy. Sega and Atari have served as market leaders throughout different gaming periods, holding the largest shares in the home console markets. However, fewer people will be aware that there was a brief moment in history when the two legendary companies intended to launch a console together. In today's tantalising upload, we will revisit this exciting chapter on the legacy of video games, look at how they still came together, how it fell apart, and equally as importantly, what could have been. So with all this said, I am Lady Decade and this is the story of the Atari Genesis. Last week on the channel we discussed a bizarre scenario in 1983 that nearly saw Atari becoming the worldwide distributor of the Famicom outside of Japan. If the deal had officially been struck and the Atari Entertainment System was released, we would have had a completely different video game timeline to the one we live in now. Sadly, negotiations would begin to fall apart at the Consumer Electronics Show of that year, when Atari reps witnessed a Coleco version of Donkey Kong being played on a Coleco Adam home computer. This incident enraged Atari, bearing in mind Atari had the licensing rights to produce all home computer versions of the game. Ultimately, while this event would not serve as the final nail in the coffin for the distribution deal, it slowed things down enough that by the time Nintendo was ready to progress, the situation had evolved somewhat. Atari's Ray Kassar, who was spearheading the deal, was fired from the company amidst profit losses and accusations of dealing in insider trading. The US video game crash of 1983 was a messy period, and Atari could no longer afford the fees required to strike a deal with the Big N. The two companies would go their separate ways, with Atari being acquired by former Commodore owner Jack Tramiel in 1984, later releasing the Atari 7800 home console. Nintendo then took on the American market by itself in 1986 with the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System, which would subsequently dominate the market. As the title of this video suggests, Nintendo would not be the only company from Japan where Atari would end up in talks to distribute a game console. Later, a similar scenario would unfold whereby they would gain the opportunity to distribute the Sega Mega Drive in the United States. You know, the system they would later refer to as the Genesis. Before the Sega Genesis, we of course had the Sega Master System, a platform that sold great here in Europe and over in the vast land of Brazil. However, in the United States, things were not quite as rosy. Previously, Sega of America had repackaged the Sega SG-1000 Mark III as the Master System, much like Nintendo had done with the Famicom and NES before, with both efforts being designed to appeal to Western tastes. The Master System sold pretty poorly in its first year, which was in no way helped that Sega of America's marketing team only had 2 staff members. In 1987, a deal was made with the toy company Tonka, who would distribute the console going forward, a move that seemed to make sense to Sega of America, considering that the NES was being marketed as a toy. While the distribution of the Master System changed, this was not enough to make the platform a success in the North American market. If Sega were to make a splash in the region, significant changes would be needed to catch up with Nintendo. But how are they going to do so without plans for a certain blue hedgehog even conceived yet? This brings us to Dave Rosen, the man who set up Sega of America in the first place, functioning as the chairman of the US division of the company and in charge of all overseas operations. If Sega were to become the market leader in the region, they needed to work with a company that already had experience and, more importantly, a company that had Michael Katz as president of Atari's video game division. You see, under Katz's leadership, he had somewhat managed to turn things around in the company since the crash back in 1983, and everything was coming up Milhouse for Atari. While the NES had huge successes, the Atari Corporation released a redesigned model of the 2600 in 1986, supported by an ad campaign touting a price of under $50. With an extensive library of cartridges and a low price point, the 2600 continued to sell well into the late 1980s, with them even releasing games for it as late as 1989 and 1990, with titles such as Secret Quest and Fatal Run, for example. So while their newer 7800 consoles weren't doing great, their legacy hardware proved that Atari was still a strong enough gaming brand to generate consumer interest. In the book titled The Ultimate History of Video Games, Katz stated, Dave Rosen came to Atari and asked if we'd be interested in taking over the Genesis manufacturing, market and distribution. We came very close to making a hefty licensing deal so that Atari could jump into the 16-bit fray before Nintendo. As you can probably tell, this was a perfect opportunity for both companies to take advantage of. Atari desperately needed more powerful console hardware to capture players' hearts and imaginations. Sega felt they needed to work with people who were already proven highly competent distributors. Therefore, an Atari and Sega partnership made fantastic sense, with negotiations reportedly making it pretty far downstream. So, keeping all of this juicy information in mind, what would happen next in this bizarre gaming team-up? With the 16-bit console on the horizon, Atari reportedly began hiring staff members to work on the new Sega machine, with programmer Scott D. Williamson among these individuals. While other sources contest this story, in an old Atari Age forum post from 2011, he claims that Atari actually came up with the Genesis name. He stated, "We were originally hired to write games for the Tomahawk. That was the name that Sega gave their new Mega Drive system for North America. From what I know, Atari Vice President Larry Siegel had been brokering a deal where I believe Atari would be the North American, possibly worldwide, distributor for the system and its games. Sega was looking for an aggressive American name for the console. That's what led to the name Tomahawk, but we didn't like it very much. We had an office contest to see who could come up with a better name. I think the price was a steak dinner. Steve Rhino came up with the name Genesis, either as the console that would redefine gaming or after the effect in the Star Trek II movie. Either way, it stuck. The deal later fell through, and I don't know if Steve ever got his prize, but that's seriously how the SEGA Genesis got its name. Whether this part of the deal is 100% accurate, multiple sources report that the negotiations between Sega and Atari certainly happened. So, with a deal that looked so beneficial to both parties, how could this one possibly fall apart? Well, no agreements were made, primarily down to the decisions of one person, Jack Tramiel. Jack Tramiel was an incredibly shrewd businessman who was notoriously tough to negotiate with. The founder and previous owner of Commodore International was considered by many to be a micromanager. Some have gone on record to state that he did not believe in budgets and wanted to personally approve every expense greater than $1,000. To say this man was tight-fisted would be the understatement of the century. Ahoy wrote that, although Trammel's obsession with controlling the cost of every phase of the manufacturing process had led to record profits during the home computer price war, his inflexible one-man rule had resulted in poor dealer relations and a steady turnover of top executives at Commodore. Leaving Commodore with him now owning the Atari Corp, he helped rejuvenate the company by using the remaining stock of game console inventory to keep the company afloat. At the same time, they finished developing the Atari ST home computers and range, which he intended to eat into Commodore's computer market share with. The historic nerd, who covered the Atari and Sega dealings on his channel in the past, caught up with Larry Siegel to get his take on all of this. The deal fell apart because the Trammells were the Trammells. Specific deal points may have been the excuse at the time, but the Trammells were unlike any people I've ever known before or since. The Trammells wanted the hardware, but anyone that knew them would have known making a deal with them would have been an insurmountable challenge. Management was hopeful but realistic. The programmers, like Scott, only heard the hype. It was never imminent. It went from cocktail chit-chat to discussions to negotiations, but floundered before the attorneys could screw it up. But still, the Genesis was an incredible system. So what was Trammell's disinterest about? According to Mike Katz, this was mostly all down to money. Trammell saw that distributing the Genesis to take on Nintendo's NES was too costly. He had far more interest in pumping cash into the Atari ST range to try and take over the home computer industry. After all, home computers were what Jack experienced at Commodore, with him wanting to continue that trend now with Atari. While no Atari SEGA distribution deal was ever finalised, the story doesn't end here, as there was one more twist to this tale which arguably helped the SEGA Genesis become the success it was over in North America. It turns out that Mike Katz, spearheading Atari's game division, was so impressed with the SEGA Genesis that just 1 year into the hardware's launch, he would jump ship and become the new president of SEGA of America. He effectively became Jack Tramiel's competition in the home console market. In a SEGA16.com interview, Katz stated, "The success of Genesis initially came from us having the personality licensing position for software. It was defensive and brilliant, if I do say so myself. We could not compete with the strength of Nintendo arcade licenses, so as a defensive move, we decided to get, for awareness, personalities. Montana, Pat Riley, Lasorda, Michael Jackson, Holyfield, develop good games around them and make the most of a tough competitive positioning / stance. Genesis does what Nintendo don't, which meant to the consumer more powerful hardware, 16-bit graphics / animation, and exclusive personalities that Nintendo couldn't claim to have. This was smart marketing, and as Howard Lincoln from Nintendo is quoted as saying, was that caused Mr. Arakawa, Nintendo of America's president, to admit privately had turned the tide towards Sega in 1991. The greatest console war had officially begun, with a former Atari employee at the Sega helm. Well, today the next Sega of America president, Tom Kalinske, is often given much of the credit for Sega's advantage in the console wars. The inventor of the marketing phrase, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't," Michael Katz, believes otherwise. He stated it irks him that subsequent Sega management has taken credit for many of his positive steps. He adds, "Competitive advertising / positioning has always been a strong weapon for me. I started as a brand manager at Lever Brothers, and we competed against Procter & Gamble with competitive advertising. Right after I became vice president of marketing at Coleco, we did the first ever 1979 competitive electronic games TV commercial against Mattel in the handheld game space. Coleco's Mr. Quarterback versus Mattel Football 1. Ironic because I started the handheld games line at Mattel. I had a history of seeing competitive commercials work when your product had a strong message / advantage versus competition. Against Nintendo, Genesis had a compelling product story, and we needed to raise hell / make noise with maximum awareness and a gutsy get in their face approach. I didn't talk to / fight with Sega Japan about it. I just told Dave Rosen that this is what we were going to do. I told the ad agency to execute on a competitive strategy, and the rest is history." Through all this, you can see the butterfly effect of Sega's dealings with Atari led to the Genesis does what Nintendo don't campaign, with Sega eventually becoming the market leader. Who knows what would have happened if history had unfolded a little differently, with Jack Tramiel greenlighting the distribution of the Atari Genesis. If you enjoyed this one, make sure you subscribe for regular weird gaming history, and check out this video right now covering the Atari NES. See you soon.